My name is John Lobell. I teach architecture at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York. You can reach me at johnlobell@mac.com, and I blog at johnlobell.com. This is a lecture on Egyptian architecture for first-year architectural students at Pratt, given in October 2013. Okay, Egypt. We begin with our geographical setting. We are in northeastern Africa, up here in the corner. And the single most important thing about Egypt is it is the Nile Valley. So we've got, right, there's a problem in agriculture. You plant a crop, wheat. It grows, great. Next year, it's not quite as good. Third year, it won't grow. You've taken all the nitrogen out of the soil. There's plenty of nitrogen in the air, but it's very difficult for it to lock up with things and become useful. So you can do slash and burn. You cut down the forest, grow your crop here, you burn it, cut it down, burn it. That gets nutrients into the soil. Then you move over, next year you do it here, next year you do it here. 5 years later, you come back to the first place again, and the natural vegetation has replenished the nitrogen in the soil. That's called slash and burn. Alternatively, you can do crop rotation. You plant something like alfalfa, has nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the nodules in its roots, and that will put nitrogen in the soil. The next year, you can grow your wheat again. Third possibility is you can use artificial fertilizer, which is what we do today. Now, there's one other technique that's going to happen real soon. Anybody know what that is? You can genetically engineer the wheat so that it's able on its own to get the nitrogen out of the atmosphere. Take the DNA and the nitrogen-fixing bacteria that knows how to do this and genetically modify the wheat to be able to do it. So that's coming. But the Egyptians had this great boom, which is, look at all this river tributaries down here. All the rainforest, jungle, rotting gunk of half of Africa every year when the Nile flooded, because the rains come and it would bring all this to lower Egypt, the lower Nile, I'll get to that in a minute, flood, and then retreat and have put all that fertile gunk on the ground. So that was the regular, totally predictable flooding of the Nile for centuries was the key thing that made Egypt possible. Now, just for our reference here, Lower Egypt is north. The delta of the Nile is Lower Egypt. Upper Egypt is south, and it's based on the direction of the river. And it's very confusing, but it has to do with lower is the direction the river is going. So, our cultural setting, a 3,000-year continuity divided into 5 major periods. Our periods are, the red ones are the ones we're going to look at. So first you have pre-dynastic and early dynastic periods, lays the foundations of the culture, unifies Upper and Lower Egypt, raised a pharaonic pharaoh, it's a priest king, theocratic state, and mud brick Mastaba tombs. Then we have Old Kingdom. We'll look at that. So we're not going to look at pre-dynastic. Old Kingdom is when they built the pyramids. Then there's Middle Kingdom. Nothing happened. If you're an Egyptologist, you care about Middle Kingdom. We don't. They made a couple pyramids and they fell down because they lost the technique. And then New Kingdom is the period of the great temples. It's the imperialistic period. It's the period of Ramesses II, who had great conquests. And then finally, the Ptolemaic period is Ptolemy is the ruler who Alexander the Great leaves when he conquers Egypt. And from 300 BC to 30 BC, Egypt is ruled by Greeks. So Cleopatra was a Greek. But her family had been ruling Egypt for quite some time. In very simplistic terms, there are 4 major means of production in human history that are very determinate of human culture. So we have hunting gathering, which we spoke about when we looked at our Paleolithic and hunting gathering cultures. Then we have agriculture, which is the period we're looking at now. It brings us up to the 1700s. Then we have industrialization beginning in the 1700s. We'll be looking at it in some detail in the next year. And then maybe we're no longer in the industrial age, we're in the electronic information biotech age. Now, key thing to remember is, with the exception of hunting and gathering, the previous cultures don't go away. We still have agriculture today. But when you look at the colonial America, the time they were deciding to secede from Britain, have the revolution, forming the Constitution, etc., 97% of Americans were farmers. And today, maybe 2% of Americans are farmers. We grow a lot more food than they did, but because such a small percentage of the population is involved, it doesn't form our mentality. So when we say the industrial era, we mean that the active industry, large scale, taking of resources from the ground, assembly line, mass production, use of the powers from fossil fuels, of steam, these influence a whole way of thinking. And we're still making big things. We still make automobiles in big factories, but we are so influenced by our electronic age that we say we're no longer an industrial age, even though we still have industry. So for today, we're talking about an agricultural period. And remember our list for high civilizations. The key thing is large-scale agriculture leading to irrigation and therefore engineering, property and therefore surveying, particularly in Egypt, because, well, see, from this rock to this rock is mine. But when it's under 6 feet of Nile flooding mud, the rock's gone. So now you have to say, well, if you line up with that hill, that's surveying. And it's a sophisticated technology which they've developed. Calendrics, astronomy, to know when to plant, when to harvest, leading to specialization, hierarchical social order, writing, to keep records of all this, which then leads to history and king lines. So in Egypt, they know the name of every king and their dates, or every pharaoh and their dates. Theocratic nation states and empires, all the elements of statecraft, syncretic religion put together from the peoples you conquer, and monumental architecture. These are the characteristics of high civilizations. So with Egypt, we've got, it's a high civilization, annual flooding of the Nile, making possible this large-scale agriculture, major urban centers, some of which are just now being discovered, whole areas of the desert, sophisticated satellite surveillance is saying, wow, they're going out and digging up whole new cities. Masterly theocratic statecraft, syncretic religion, 3,000-year continuity, interest in the afterlife, mummies. The thing is, many civilizations practice this. We have Incan mummies. So it's not unique to the Egyptians, but it was characteristic of the Egyptians. Monumental architecture and domesticity and a cult of beauty. We'll talk about this at the end. Our colleague Donald Cromley, who you heard a couple of weeks ago, is extremely interested in Greece. He started first by reading the histories, then he read the tragedies, and he visits every year. So one of our Greek historians, referred to as the father of history, is Herodotus, who traveled to Egypt and wrote a history of Egypt. And I'm not going to stay here to go through this whole slide of everything that he addressed, but anybody know roughly the dates of the pyramids? 2500 BC. Okay, so let's round this off here to 500 BC. When Herodotus got to Egypt, the pyramids were already 2,000 years old. So he asked the Egyptians, what's that? They said, we don't know. They were here when we got here. They're 2,000 years old. They didn't know that they were that old, but there wasn't anybody there who remembered building one. So it's interesting to think of these spans of time. But he did very thorough studies of Egypt. A lot of the material he didn't get right, but it's still useful to us to this day. Now, here's when modern archaeology begins. We're in the midst of the French Revolution, and the committees of the revolution are meeting, and there's this very ambitious young colonel who's like moving up through the ranks, and everybody, this is dangerous. This guy's going to try to take over. What are we going to do with this guy? His name is Napoleon. So at one point Napoleon said, well, why don't I go conquer Egypt? And everybody said, that's a great idea. Get this guy out of here. So he gets an expedition together. And here's a list of who he took. Mathematicians, chemists, astronomers, writers, economists, on and on. And so this is one of the great gatherings of intellect. And these people, like the mathematicians, later became the most famous mathematicians of their time. They were these young, ambitious people who were just in great adventure to go on. They go off, the fleet lands them, and then the fleet gets destroyed by the British. The British are always better in naval battles than the French, and Napoleon's stuck there. Well, Egypt is ruled, and this is just such a great story, by the Mamluks. The Mamluks are slave kings. They're slaves and they're the kings of Egypt. They're the rulers. And there's a book called The Blue Nile, 2 books by Moorhead, The White Nile and The Blue Nile, and they are some of the greatest reading you'll ever do. And The Blue Nile begins with Napoleon's expedition in Egypt. It's one of the best descriptions of it. So Napoleon has brought with him artists and surveyors, and they measure everything. I didn't think to bring it in. I have the book that they produced. Just the illustrations, not the text, is a book that was published recently of these fantastic engravings of all these ruins. And some of them are valuable because since then, due to them being messed over, a lot of the color work here has been lost. And among other things, they found the Rosetta Stone. So that's the name of the town where it was found. But no one could penetrate Egyptian hieroglyphs. They just couldn't translate them. But they found this stone that had an edict in 3 languages, 2 of which the Europeans could master, and the third one being the hieroglyphs, and that gave them the code to crack the hieroglyphs. And so it was done later by an Englishman. The English took the stone when they defeated Napoleon. So that's the beginning of what we know about Egypt. And the key thing, again, with Egypt is the Nile and its annual regular flooding into a contained valley. And so this brown here shows us the extent of the flooding. So 90% to this day of the Egyptian population lives in this area, and the rest of Egypt is empty. But it made possible this large-scale agriculture, which made possible the feeding of a huge population, and then the specialization into the arts and culture that are with us to this day. Now, because they had stone, which the Mesopotamians did not, or had very little of, their monuments are built in stone. They engrave on the stone depictions of their life, and so we know a lot about it. Here are fishermen on the Nile, and here is how they processed the wheat. This Nile gives us what we might call a symbolic orientation for Egypt, which is the way. The idea is this linear orientation in one's life. One proceeds through one's life in an orderly fashion, and then through one's afterlife. And the Book of the Dead describes every step you'll go through, and you'll pass a door and you have to name every part of the door, so you have to memorize all this so you can get through your death in good shape. The Egyptian temple, which we'll look at shortly, is very linear in its orientation, and there's nothing on the outside. You don't say, I think I can walk around and look at the back. You don't do that. you're not free to do that. And there's nothing on those walls because they don't think of that as existing. And very famously, the columns are on the inside because that's where you are, and they shield the wall, whereas on the Greek temple, they're on the outside. The religion, again, is syncretic. I'm not going to go through them, but these are a set of their deities. Some of their primal deity is Hathor, who is an ancient cow goddess. Remember the importance of the horns in the cave paintings that remain with us. The horned animal is symbolic of the crescent moon. And then to the left of that is an Neolithic Egyptian sculpture of Hathor, her arms symbolic of the moon. So when you see here, this is Hathor. Hathor has these pincers up containing the disk of the moon. Now this is a judgment before Osiris from the Book of the Dead. It's one of our required slides. And so a man has died, is being escorted, and then his heart is weighed against a feather. And if his heart is heavier than the feather, this jackal god devours him. And this is indicative of your purity, that you've cleansed your karma of all the crud, so that you go into death without these, this weight. And then you come before the judgment of Osiris. So the Book of the Dead is more recently this is from New Kingdom, but it's adopted from pyramid text, carvings on the chambers in the pyramids are earlier versions of this. Key deity is Isis, and her brother is Osiris, and they are brother-sister, also husband-wife, and the Egyptian pharaohs practiced brother-sister marriage, but then the pharaoh also has hundreds of concubines, so we can keep our genetic variety. Now, Osiris is killed by his brother Seth, who dismembers him and scatters the pieces, and Isis reconstructs him and brings him back to life. So Osiris is a dying and resurrecting god. So we have one here already. So our two periods are Old Kingdom and New Kingdom. And our Old Kingdom, we have pyramids, and we begin our story of the pyramids with the Mastaba. So the Mastaba is sometimes stone, but usually mud brick, it can be either, of burial mounds. So here we have a group of mastabas. Each one of these is for somebody's burial. So this is the above ground monument. We then drop down with a tube into the burial chamber. And we can understand the pyramid as a series of stacked mastabas that eventually become the pyramid. And then the burial chamber moves up in the pyramid. So we're going to see in a minute the step pyramid began as a mastaba, and then King Zoser didn't die. He was a long time. What the hell, we put on all that. And so it kept going up. And then we see in the Great Pyramid, the initial burial chamber is underground. Here, then it gets moved up, and moved up, and moved up. And so we are going from returning to the body of the goddess to relating to the sky god. So rather than our relation to the deity being into the ground, we go up to heaven, or up to the masculine sky god figure. So our first example here is Zoser's step pyramid, and there are various spellings for Zoser, so you can be D-J-O-S-E-R. And this is our first named known architect. So the architect is Imhotep. And here he is. So we have a first architect in history that we know who he is. Here again, it begins as a mastaba. They then add on to it, and Zoser still doesn't die, so then they make it much bigger. It's part of a complex, 35-acre complex, and it's used for what's called the Hebset Festival. And so periodically, the king has to run a race to prove his continuing vitality. So the king has to be healthy and vital for the kingdom to be healthy and vital. So one of the uses of the pyramid is that it brings down Ka energy, which is the sky energy, to animate and enrich our lives. So the pyramid is a vehicle for doing that, but the pharaoh is also. So the pharaoh receives this energy from the heavens and then enriches all of us. So if the pharaoh is not well, we're not well. The step pyramid is 204 feet high, so think roughly a 25-story building if it's a 23-story building. If it's an apartment building with 8 foot 6 with the slab floors. Now, the outer wall of the complex has fake temple fronts, and they alternate temple fronts from Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. So Egypt had been two kingdoms, and before this dynastic period had been united, one conquered the other. And so we now respect both of these kingdoms. The pharaoh's crown is a combination of the two of them. Now here's an interesting example. There's an architect we'll see next year named Robert Venturi, and he refers to, in architecture, there are two approaches. He calls them the duck and the decorated shed. So in duck architecture, the shape of the building communicates what it's about. And so the step pyramid's a duck. In decorated shed, you make a serviceable building, then you stick a fake front on the front of it. Doesn't have to have any relationship to what's behind it. Here we are in one of the earliest examples of monumental architecture. We have both the duck and the decorated shed, because these are fake facades. Now, the pyramid is a burial tomb for the pharaoh. The ziggurat is a base for a temple. So they're similar in form, and they're similar in they symbolize the world mountain that we saw among the shamans, now manifest in a high culture, but they are different in these functions. So remember, pyramid, a burial tomb for a pharaoh, ziggurat, a base for a temple. So the Great Pyramids, and they are described variously. So in our list of required buildings, we're referring to Cheops, Chefren, and Mykerinos. And Cheops could also be Khufu. When you're starting with a hieroglyph, there are a lot of ways to translate it. But this is the Great Pyramid, Cheops. So 756 feet on a side, 481 feet high. It's less now because the outer material has been stripped away. So that's, I live in Waterside Plaza. We're 40 stories. We're 8'6", 8 feet ceilings, 6-inch slab, guessing. This is much taller than a 40-story apartment building. So these are big. They're oriented north, south, east, west. They are built in limestone and were originally then covered with highly polished limestone. They're not believed to have been painted, so they would gleam very light gray, almost white in the sun. The outer layers have been stripped away for the most part. You take that limestone, you put it in great fires, and you can make plaster. And so that subsequent building in Egypt and building materials, these ancient monuments become mines for later buildings. So for example, later we're going to see the dome, the inside of the dome of the Pantheon was covered with bronze coffers, and that got stripped away. Is Anthony Cardona here? What did they use that bronze for? The baldacchino in St. Peter's. Great. So it's the stuff is continually being stripped away, hopefully used for good stuff subsequently. Now, these pyramids are not, again, isolated. They're part of pyramid complexes. Remember I said the idea of the way, this path. So this is the funerary temple where the body of the dead pharaoh is prepared and then proceeds along this way. So there's a whole series of things that happen along this way. Here's a section with a underground chamber. This is called the Queen's Chamber and the King's Chamber, but they're all for the pharaoh, and to change their mind as they were building it and raise the burial chamber upward. Here's a plan of the complex. We see these processionals. Now, once again, no space aliens. It's not hard to build a pyramid. You just need a lot of people and a lot of ropes. And slavery comes about in the New Kingdom. So slavery was not part of this culture. Slaves didn't build them. It's believed that they were built by farmers during the off-season. And you can calculate how many people you need, and it's a lot, but it's not impossible. How you get those stones up there, there's two theories. One is just a very long ramp to drag them up, and the other is building a spiral around, which then gets filled in to get a smooth pyramid. It's not just piled up rocks. They're very complicated. You have huge amount of forces here, and so they're arranged in this sort of leaning inward pattern to try to bring your forces down away from the outside of the building down to the center. This chamber here is under a huge amount of force, and so these are all relieving stones to handle. First of all, we take the force coming down and we move it away from the space in sort of a corbel arch, and then relieving stones, and then this is the chamber. So very capable building here. And I just made a point of not using the word engineering. And I'll tell you why. I'll discuss this again with Gothic cathedrals. But engineering is modeling something before you make it, typically modeling it in mathematics. So that if you want to make a beam that's spanning between two posts, well, how big does the beam have to be? Well, we have formulas. You can make a mathematical model that will tell you. These people didn't use mathematical models, so it's not engineering, but it's building. Now, do not write this down, and we do not want to see this on an exam. This is anecdotal, but really interesting. So we said, well, the pyramids have 4 sides. No, they don't. They have 8 sides. Nobody ever noticed this. For hundreds of years, people are measuring these things and surveying these things and putting them in textbooks. And one day in the 1920s, somebody's in an airplane photographing this just at the point that the rising sun is raking this surface. Oh my God, it's got a dent in it. It dents inward. And probably done to make it look flat. It probably makes it look crisper when you do that. It might look like it's bulging a bit if you don't do that. Although when Donald talks about Greek temples, he'll speculate that, that may not be optical correction. It may be that it's very deliberate. But the point I want to make is, for example, you look at Gothic cathedrals in a textbook, and they have repeated bays. And if you look at the plans, they're all perfect and identical. Well, they weren't. They're all quite crooked because they were built over hundreds of years by people who weren't that precise about that kind of thing. But we kind of said, well, everything's got to line up. So when we make the drawing, we make everything line up. So everybody thought they knew what the pyramids looked like and made drawings of them, but somebody had, oh my God. So anyway, don't want to hear that on an exam. That's anecdotal, interesting. It's just a lesson that anything anybody tells you, don't hesitate to double check it. Okay, Old Kingdom pyramids, New Kingdom. This is an imperialistic period. We have conquest. We have an emperor. Now, an emperor is different from a king. There's a kind of whole typology of what a nation state is and what an empire is. Empires are almost always solar. The emperor is almost always a sun king. Chinese emperor is a sun king. Louis XIV was a sun king. These pharaohs are sun kings. There's a whole typology that goes with this. But it's a time of conquests. Things get bigger. We have the reigns of the people you've heard of. So everybody's heard of Tutankhamenon. What's the name we know him by? It's King Tut. Why is he so important? Right, we found his tomb intact. He was a very minor figure who died very young, didn't do anything important, but his tomb was found intact, so it's very important. We'll look briefly at Ramesses. He's the great warrior conqueror, and we'll look at Hatshepsut. We'll see her funerary temple. And Akhenaten is interesting too. Well, we're going to get to them, so I shouldn't look at this. And we have this massive stone temples at Amon and Karnak and Luxor, and they keep getting added onto. And the pyramid is still there, but it becomes the obelisk, a ray of the sun. The other thing to notice is that as we go through history, we're moving south. So, a typical Egyptian pyramid. Number one, sphinx or ram-lined avenues. So we approach by a long avenue, linear. It's lined with sphinxes or rams. Then we have twin obelisks, which is what remains of the pyramid. We then have the pylon, two parts, entrance in between. Saw a hint of that form in the Dogon. We'll see it again in the Gothic cathedral. We then have a series of spaces. So the hypostyle courtyard, this is open to the outside, to above. Then we have the hypostyle hall with a small hall. And then we come back to the holy places, sanctuaries, only the highest initiated priests go there. We get the barge, etc. So it's a linear experience. Here's Temple of Amon mud and in Luxor, added on to over a period of over 100 years. We can see we're starting here, then we had this, then we had this. And this thing is so big that there's a mosque in the middle of it. So these things are absolutely gigantic. Now these obelisks, it's one piece of stone, and they're quarried in place. We know exactly how they quarried them because they clear away the top, then they come down the sides, and then they go underneath. And there's one that they stopped halfway through because they discovered a crack in it. So we can see the technique. So when we see obelisks around Europe, including in front of St. Peter's, these come from Egypt. They're hauled off by the Europeans. And we have a small one in back of the Metropolitan Museum here in New York. And we have a small Egyptian temple. So Temple of Dendur, and we're recommending that next week, I have some announcements, and one of them is next week no class, so we'll get to that in a minute, but we recommend you go to the Met at that time, and you might want to make a sketch of the temple. Now, this is very miniaturized from what we've been looking at, but we're going to see the Aswan Dam in a moment. We'll talk about it, and this was going to be flooded. So, Abu Simbel was going to be flooded, and the United States paid to rescue it, and so the Egyptians gave the United States this temple as a gift. Now, it's 15 BC, it's during the Roman period, so it's when the Romans are controlling Egypt. So, among our New Kingdom figures is Queen Hatshepsut, a remarkable ruler, extremely successful, and the female rulers are exceptional, but they did exist. She's the most prominent one in Egypt, and during ceremonies, she has a ceremonial beard that she wears. You see sculptures of her with that. Her architect for her funerary temple is Sednet, who's also her lover, and she was extremely successful rule, bringing prosperity through trade. Early in her rule, she did the military necessities and reestablished the strength of their borders, and then greatly increased Egyptian prosperity through trade, and was able, therefore, do a lot of building. And this building is regarded as one of the buildings that is comparable in elegance to classical Greek and Roman architecture. Our other figure is Ramses II. He lived to either 90 or 99, different records, but he was a ruler for 66 years. Again, huge building projects and expansions and great military conquests, and his largest military venture was a bust, but he had a good propaganda machine to say it was a success, even though it wasn't. And this is Ramses. We have several of them, just in case, and then here's his wife. So this will recall to you the larger figure of the ruler we saw in Mesopotamia. This is even much larger. Well, the idea that the Nile flooded regularly every year and made Egypt fertile and wealthy was not good enough. We need to put a dam up, and so we can control the Nile. Well, this idea was so dumb in the 1950s that America decided they would not fund it, but the Russians did, because the Russians and Americans were competitive for who's going to get allies around the world. They built the Aswan Dam, created Lake Nasser, which submerged a lot of important ruins, and including this, but America paid to haul it up the hill, which was quite a feat because it's really big. And so that it was in return for that we were given the temple. Another ruler of this period is Akhenaten. His wife is Nefertiti. And he introduced the idea of one God. And this was so controversial, there was so much cultural investment in their elaborate pantheon that he built a new capital away from the priests, and where that sun god was worshipped. The moment he died, they buried the capital and moved everything back and went back to their old ways. Here's Akhenaten and Nefertiti. And now, something I should have gone into more, but a quick footnote on Egyptian art style. Egyptian art is highly conventional. We non-Egyptologists, if we look at something from the pyramids, 2500 BC. You look at something with the time of Cleopatra, we can't tell the difference. The style is you're always shoulder forward, so there's no such thing as a profile of your shoulders, but head is always profile. You always get one eye. You never have face forward. You do it in sculpture, but you don't in the art. So that is, it's highly conventionalized, and for 2,000 plus years, no artist ever dared, why don't I do something different? No, you don't do that in these cultures. So here is a very domestic scene of Akhenaten and Nefertiti with their children. Here's the sun god radiating them, but it's still within this convention. Although, see how relaxed they are. It's less formal than earlier Egyptian art. Okay, wrapping up. Domesticity. These people really made comfortable lives for themselves. They have comfortable houses. There's a burial tomb that was discovered that was filled with these little models. There's a whole little room for this in the Metropolitan Museum, so take a look at it. But it's extremely informative about how they lived. So here is a grand estate, wealthy people. Here are their fig trees. Here are storage jars for their oils. And we're going to actually understand more about how these things work when we get to Jesus, what's the Roman city that's buried by the Pompeii? Pompeii, thank you. When we get to Pompeii, because everything was preserved intact, it was just whoosh in one day, the whole thing buried. So we can see how, where they kept their food and all that kind of stuff. And here's a modest house. Their house, the little walled garden with their fig trees. Here they are tending their cattle. These are all little models that we can see in the Met. The other thing is beauty. Now, when we talk about the art of various cultures, particularly when we get to painting, we're going to talk about the light. And every part of the world has different light. So we get to London, this fog. Not as bad pollution as it used to be, but there's a lot of moisture in the air. And it produces a certain quality of light. You get to Greece, much less moisture. A little bit, but much less. Get to Egypt, no moisture in the air. So the sunlight is extremely intense, and they're very aware of how that light's going to rake across the architecture. And so this profile will pick up the sunlight. Here we have a human figure, a lovely woman in a diaphanous robe, and so you see the body through the cloth, and it's kind of showing the ability of the sculptor to portray translucent cloth. And then here are three pieces. Here is the gold mask of King Tut's tomb, very gaudy by any aesthetic value, not a high quality work of art. The stuff of King Tut's time was not a high point in the arts. So yes, it's gold, yes, it's gaudy, it's colorful, but we should begin to be able to develop a sense of judgment of what we like and think is of quality. This is a portrait bust of Nefertiti, Akhenaten's wife, in a German museum. Often described as the most beautiful woman who ever lived. And looking at this, you can make that case. So look at the elongated neck and look at the muscles coming up the neck here. So very elegant in the way this is portrayed. And finally, this is a fragment in yellow jasper, again, at the Metropolitan Museum. And it's, I think, so I'm just going to give you my judgment here, and you can start developing your own. Incredibly beautiful. The way the line of the jaw, the fullness of the lips. The lips are a different color than the skin, but you can't portray that in sculpture. So this little line here that's portraying this color difference. So the elegance of the curvature, the proportioning here, even though this is a broken fragment, quite beautiful, and the Egyptians were very into beauty. When you go to the Met collection, you'll see lots of jewelry and even makeup kits. So they're very sensitive. So, our takeaway for Egypt: high civilization, importance of the Nile, the way, the procession to the pyramids, the succession of spaces in the temple, and the movement through your life, the Old Kingdom pyramids, New Kingdom temples, domesticity, and the importance of beauty, and you've got on the LMS the required buildings, one of which is the Great Pyramids. One last word. Did the Egyptians build pyramids? Well, obviously, yes. But it would be a mistake to say the Egyptians built pyramids. Everybody built pyramids. What we looked at is not an exception. There are Egyptian pyramids. There are Mesopotamian pyramids. There are Mayan Mexican pyramids. There are Buddhist stupas, which are pyramidal. And then, if we say that the pyramid is built by a theocratic nation state after a period of four-quartered Bronze Age warrior chieftains and before empires, empires don't build pyramids. There were no pyramids in the New Kingdom that we just looked at. They're built during the theocratic nation state period. If we were to sort of understand a whole typology of what a pyramid is and when a culture builds it, we then ask, is the Gothic cathedral a pyramid? And it's something we can talk about in a few weeks. Thank you.